At the grand gates of an estate worth millions, an old man in a faded uniform swept fallen leaves. His back was slightly hunched, his shoes worn thin, his face lined with age. To the outside world, he looked like a simple gatekeeper. But behind those tired eyes was Richard Collins, one of the city's wealthiest men. And today, he wasn't guarding his mansion, he was guarding his son's future. Richard Collins sat alone in his study, the flickering fireplace casting long shadows across the shelves lined with leather-bound books. He was a man who had built his empire from nothing, brick by brick, deal by deal, until his name was synonymous with power and wealth. Yet, for all his fortune, Richard carried one worry that money could not quiet, the future of his only son, Michael. Michael had recently announced his intention to marry a young woman named Emily. She was kind, beautiful, and intelligent, or so Michael said. But Richard had seen too much of the world to take things at face value. Too often he had watched people draw near, not out of love or loyalty, but because of what his name represented: privilege, status, endless wealth. As a father, Richard wanted his son to experience the kind of love that money could never buy, the kind he once had with his late wife, before tragedy left him widowed. He feared Michael, young and idealistic, might not recognize the difference between true affection and gold-digging charm. That night, as rain tapped softly against the windowpanes, Richard wrestled with a plan. He knew he couldn't simply accuse Emily or forbid the marriage, doing so would only drive Michael away. No, if he wanted answers, he would need to find them himself. And then the thought struck him. What if he stripped away the wealth? What if Emily met him not as the billionaire patriarch of the Collins estate, but as a man of no influence, no power? Someone invisible, someone people often overlooked. The idea grew, and with it, Richard's resolve. He would disguise himself as the estate's gatekeeper, a role simple enough to explain his presence near Emily, yet humble enough to test her heart. If she treated him with the same respect and kindness she showed when others were watching, Richard would know her love was genuine. By the next morning, his mind was made up. He traded his tailored suit for a faded uniform, polished shoes for worn boots, and his commanding posture for a slight stoop. Looking in the mirror, Richard barely recognized himself. For the first time in decades, he wasn't the billionaire at the top of the tower. He was just a gatekeeper. And in that disguise, he would discover the truth about Emily, and the future of his son's happiness. The following afternoon, the Collins estate gleamed under the golden sun. Tall wrought iron gates guarded the long driveway, and for the first time in decades, Richard stood there not as the master of the house but as its gatekeeper. His hands bore borrowed work gloves, and his suit had been replaced by a worn jacket and a cap pulled low over his brow. He leaned casually against the small gatehouse, a broom in his hands, rehearsing the role of a quiet old worker. It wasn't long before a sleek sedan pulled up. Inside sat Emily, Michael's fiancée. She stepped out gracefully, carrying herself with a poise that hinted at her upbringing. She was dressed simply, though with subtle elegance, her long hair tied back in a ribbon. "Good afternoon," Richard said, deliberately lowering his voice to sound rougher, older. "Who are you here to see?" Emily smiled warmly. "Hello. I'm here to see Michael. I believe he's expecting me." Her tone was polite, free of the condescension Richard often heard from people when they addressed those in service roles. Still, he tested further. "You know, visits here usually need approval," he muttered, pretending to scrutinize her. "Can't just let anyone through." Emily didn't roll her eyes or snap impatiently. Instead, she clasped her hands and nodded. "I understand. If you'd like, I can call Michael to let him know I'm here." Her kindness disarmed him, but Richard pressed on. "It's a long walk up that driveway," he remarked. "Don't suppose a fine young lady like you would want to take that walk." To his surprise, Emily laughed lightly. "I don't mind walking if it means I get to see him. A little fresh air won't hurt." Richard studied her closely. There was no trace of entitlement, no sign of irritation at being delayed by a supposed gatekeeper. She even asked about him, "Do you work here often? It must be a peaceful job, guarding such a beautiful place." For a moment, Richard forgot to act. Her sincerity caught him off guard, softening his suspicion just slightly. As he opened the gate at last, he couldn't help but think, if this was an act, it was remarkably convincing. But he knew better than to trust first impressions. This was only the beginning of the test. The next day, Richard decided to deepen his test. If Emily's kindness toward a stranger was genuine, it would show when there was nothing to gain. Disguised again as the gatekeeper, he prepared a little scenario. He carried an old satchel filled with worn tools and intentionally left a few heavy boxes near the path leading to the mansion. He knew Michael had invited Emily over again that afternoon. When she arrived, Emily parked her modest car outside the gates. She greeted Richard cheerfully, just as before, and walked toward the driveway. But before she could go far, she noticed the older man bending down awkwardly, struggling to lift one of the boxes. Richard exaggerated his movements, groaning as if the weight was too much for him. Without hesitation, Emily rushed to his side. "Oh, let me help you with that," she said, already reaching for the box. Richard waved her off, grumbling, "No, no. These are too heavy for a lady like you. Go on, you'll dirty your clothes." But Emily stood firm. "Please, sir, I insist. No one should carry so much on their own." She knelt down, grabbed the edge of the box, and together they lifted it to the side of the path. Her hair fell loose from its ribbon, and her shoes scuffed against the gravel, but she didn't complain. When they set the box down, she brushed her hands together and smiled. "See? That wasn't so bad. Do you have more to move?" Richard, momentarily speechless, shook his head. "Why would you bother helping me? You don't even know me." Emily's answer was simple but piercing. "Because you needed help. That's reason enough." Those words struck him deeply. He had seen countless young women chase wealth, status, and appearances. Rarely did he see someone so unbothered by getting their hands dirty for a stranger. As she walked toward the mansion, Emily turned back and called, "Take care of yourself, okay? Don't try to do all the hard work alone." Richard stood frozen, watching her go. Beneath his disguise, his throat tightened. The test was meant to expose selfishness, but instead, it revealed something purer than he had expected. Still, he told himself, one good deed wasn't enough. The real test was yet to come. A week later, Richard decided it was time for the final test. His son Michael had planned a private dinner at the mansion with Emily, and Richard, still disguised as the gatekeeper, remained stationed near the entrance. He knew Emily had proven her kindness in small gestures, but he wanted to see her heart when faced with something more profound. As Emily arrived that evening, dressed simply but gracefully, she greeted Richard warmly. "Good evening, sir. You're still working so late?" she asked with genuine concern. Richard sighed heavily, playing his part. "Well, I don't have much choice. Rent's overdue, and my wife is sick. Hospital bills are piling up, but I'll manage somehow." He lowered his head, letting his words hang in the air like a quiet confession. For a moment, Emily stood completely still, her eyes softening. She reached into her purse and pulled out her wallet. Richard quickly waved his hands. "No, no, miss. I'm not asking you for money. Please, don't misunderstand." But Emily shook her head firmly. "You didn't ask. But if I can help, even a little, I want to." She placed a few folded bills in his hand, pressing it closed around them. Her voice trembled with sincerity. "It's not much, but maybe it can buy some medicine or a warm meal. Please, don't refuse." Richard's heart clenched. For decades, he had watched people treat workers like him as invisible, unworthy of notice. Yet here was this young woman, who had no idea she was speaking to one of the wealthiest men in the city, offering what she could without hesitation. Tears pricked at the corners of his eyes, though he quickly looked away so she wouldn't notice. You don't know what this means," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. Emily smiled softly, unaware of the storm brewing in his chest. "Sometimes, all someone needs is to know they're not alone," she said gently before heading toward the mansion. Richard remained by the gate long after she disappeared inside. The crumpled bills burned in his palm, not because of their value, but because of the purity of the gesture. In that moment, he realized he had found his answer. Emily's compassion wasn't an act. It was who she truly was. For the first time in years, Richard felt tears stream freely down his cheeks. The disguise had revealed not greed or vanity, but a heart full of selflessness. And that discovery left him humbled, and in tears. The next evening, Richard decided it was time to end the charade. The test was over, and Emily had passed in ways he hadn't even dared to hope for. He called Michael and asked him to bring Emily to the mansion's grand hall, where he would reveal the truth. When the young couple arrived, Emily looked around nervously, still unaware of what was about to unfold. Richard entered, not in his shabby gatekeeper's clothes, but in a tailored suit that revealed his true identity. Emily's eyes widened in shock. You're not the gatekeeper," she whispered. Richard smiled gently, though his eyes were wet. "No, my dear. My name is Richard Hamilton. I am Michael's father, and also the owner of this estate." Emily staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. All this time, her face flushed with embarrassment. I treated you like, oh, I'm so sorry if I offended you." But Richard stepped forward, his voice warm and steady. "On the contrary, Emily. You treated me better than most ever would. When you thought I was poor and struggling, you offered kindness, compassion, and dignity. You didn't do it to impress anyone. You did it because that's who you are." Emily's eyes glistened, and she struggled to find words. Michael slipped his arm around her shoulders, pride shining in his gaze. Richard reached into his pocket and pulled out the crumpled bills she had pressed into his hand just days earlier. He placed them gently on the table. "This," he said softly, "is worth more to me than all the wealth I have. Because in that moment, you showed me that my son has chosen a woman with a heart richer than gold." Tears streamed down Emily's face as she whispered, "I only did what I hoped someone would do for me." Richard pulled her into a fatherly embrace. "And that, my dear, is why you already belong in this family." The atmosphere in the room shifted, what began as a test had transformed into a bond. Richard, once skeptical and guarded, now looked at Emily not as his son's fiancée, but as the daughter he never knew he needed. As the evening drew to a close, Richard raised his glass in a quiet toast. "To kindness," he said, his voice trembling. "Because in the end, it's the one thing money can't buy. And the one thing that makes us truly rich."